The world didn't just stop when my 8-year-old son stood up at his birthday party. It curdled. He looked his billionaire VP stepfather dead in the eyes and said the one thing that turns a man's face to ash. As my ex-wife's champagne glass shattered against the concrete, 25 guests went deathly silent. That's when I realized my boy hadn't been playing with his toys for the last year. He'd been building a case against his own mother. Honestly, it was the kind of silent where you can hear the rustle of a blue jay's wings in the neighbor's oak tree, 3 houses down. I could hear the distant hum of a car passing 3 streets over, and it sounded like the engine was revving right through my living room. I just stood there, paralyzed behind the birthday cake. I was still clutching a plastic serrated knife, the one I'd bought specifically to cut the first slice of the dinosaur cake I'd spent half the night agonizing over. My knuckles were white against the handle, as the realization hit me like a freight train. My boy had been keeping a secret for over a year. He had a notebook, a worn, blue spiral thing tucked under his arm, and it was filled with a secret that was about to blow apart every single lie Jolene had spent 3 years meticulously building. The air felt thick, tasting of charcoal smoke and expensive perfume, a suffocating mix that made my lungs ache. My name is Donovan Reese. I'm 38 years old, and if you saw me on the street, you wouldn't look twice. I'm a mechanic. I own a small, grease-stained auto repair shop in Dayton, Ohio, called Reese's Garage. It's not fancy. It's not a startup, and there's no espresso machine in the lobby. It's just a blocky concrete building with 3 service bays that smell like gear oil and old sweat. Hanging over the door is a faded wooden sign my father carved 30 years ago. I took over the business when he passed, and I've kept the lights on ever since, working 60-hour weeks until my back feels like it's made of rusted scrap metal. That shop was the wedge that drove my marriage into the dirt. Jolene never understood it. She saw it as a lack of ambition, but to me, it was everything my father gave me. She spent the better part of our final year together, making sure I knew I was a guy who peaked in high school. In her mind, I was destined to be nothing more than a man with oil-stained fingernails. She told me that the day she packed her bags. She told her high-priced lawyer that during the divorce, and apparently, behind closed doors, she'd been whispering that same poison into our son's ear. But to understand how we got to that shattered glass at the party, we have to go back. We have to look at how this nightmare actually started. Jolene and I were high school sweethearts, married at 22. For a while, I genuinely believed we were happy. Then, enough became an insult to her. She started making snide comments about the shop, her nose wrinkling whenever I came home smelling like motor oil. She'd go on rants about how her friends' husbands wore tailored suits while I spent my days in grease-stained coveralls. I found out about Brantley 6 months before she served me the papers. It was a single text message on her phone about a reservation and missing her. When I confronted her, I got a cold, vacant stare. She looked at me like I was a total stranger, a guy she used to know but couldn't quite place. As if our 10 years together were just a boring movie, she was finally ready to turn off. The legal battle? It was a bloodbath. Brantley bankrolled the most aggressive lawyers in the state. I remember sitting in that sterile conference room, watching her lead attorney, a man in a $3,000 suit, smirk, as he laid out a calendar of every emergency roadside repair I'd taken on a Saturday. They painted me as an unstable workaholic because I chose to fix a family's only car instead of being home for a dinner. Jolene was usually spending on her phone anyway. I didn't have the money to fight that kind of high-priced fiction. By the time the judge hammered the final nail, Jolene walked away with primary custody. I was left with 14 days a month. Wednesday evenings became our ritual. I'd pick him up at 3:30 and head straight to Margie's, a greasy spoon where the vinyl booths are patched with duct tape. We always ordered 2 chocolate milkshakes and a basket of fries to share. Then we'd head back to my place to work on the project. For the last 4 months, that project was a beaten-up go-kart I'd found at a yard sale for $30. It was a rusted-out frame with flat tires and a seized engine. I remember one Wednesday. Theo was trying to loosen a bolt on the frame, and the wrench slipped, barking his knuckle. He didn't cry. He just looked at the smudge of grease and blood, looked at me and said, "It's just part of the job, right, Dad?" I stayed up late the night before the party to put the finishing touches on it, racing red with a crisp white stripe and a massive silver bow. That was going to be the moment he realized that his dad doesn't just try. His dad delivers. By 6:30 in the morning, the backyard was already a fortress of preparation. I had the heavy oak tables dragged into the shade, the mismatched folding chairs arranged in a semicircle, and the dinosaur banners hung so tight against the fence, they didn't even flutter. The dew was still clinging to the grass, soaking through my old sneakers. But the grill? It was already scrubbed to a mirror finish. I was hunched over that T-Rex cake, steadying my breathing as I carefully piped the last of the green buttercream scales. Honestly, my hands were stiff from a week of wrenching on truck engines, and this delicate work felt like trying to perform surgery with a sledgehammer. The morning air was still cool, smelling of damp earth and the faint, sweet scent of vanilla frosting. Then, the crunch of gravel in the driveway broke the silence. It made me jump, nearly smudging the T-Rex's tail. I recognized the low, rhythmic rattle of my mom's old Buick before I even saw it. She stepped out, smoothing down the same faded floral apron she's worn to every family milestone since I was in diapers. She was clutching a heavy ceramic casserole dish, the steam from her famous cheesy potatoes fogging up her glasses. "You're up early," she said, her voice soft but knowing. She set the dish down on the kitchen counter with a solid thud and leaned against the sink, just watching me work. I didn't look up. I was focusing entirely on the dinosaur's candy eye placement. "Couldn't sleep," I muttered. My heart was already doing a nervous thrum against my ribs. It was this feeling of impending static. I couldn't shake. I knew she was looking at the dark circles under my eyes, calculating exactly how many hours of rest I'd traded for this party. She nodded slowly, a small, sad smile playing on her lips. She didn't push it. She didn't have to. My mom raised me and my brother Curtis in a house that always felt one missed paycheck away from a for sale sign after my dad passed. She knew the bone-deep exhaustion of fighting for your kids when the rest of the world is just waiting for you to trip. "Jolene called yesterday," she said, her voice dropping an octave as she began unloading a stack of napkins. "Said she's bringing Brantley." I felt a cold spike of adrenaline hit my stomach, making my fingers twitch against the frosting bag. "I know," I said, keeping my eyes locked on the cake. I wasn't going to give her the satisfaction of a reaction. "It's Theo's day, not mine." I tried to convince myself that if I said it enough times, it would eventually feel true. She was quiet for a long beat. The only sound was the hum of the refrigerator and the distant chirp of a morning robin. Then she reached out and squeezed my shoulder, her grip surprisingly strong for a woman her age. "Your father would be proud of you, Donnie. You know that, right?" I didn't answer. I couldn't. I just kept frosting that damn cake until my eyes burned. 20 minutes later, Curtis pulled up in his beat-up Ford, hauling 2 extra coolers and a stack of lawn chairs that looked like they'd seen a few too many tailgates. He took one look at my face, probably the way I was white-knuckling the spatula, and just shook his head. "She's going to start something. You know that, right?" he asked. He didn't even say hello. He just popped the lid on a cooler to check the ice and jumped straight into the paranoia that had been eating at the back of my skull since I woke up. "Probably," I said, finally setting the frosting knife down. My palms were sweaty, so I wiped them on my jeans. "And you're just going to take it?" Curtis's jaw was already set, his eyes scanning the yard like he was looking for a fight. "Just sit there and play the part of the struggling ex while that bank teller in a suit looks down his nose at us?" I looked my brother in the eye, my voice coming out flatter than I intended. "What do you want me to do, Curtis? Make a scene at my son's 8th birthday party? Give her exactly what she wants? Proof that I'm the unstable guy her lawyers talked about?" He didn't have an answer for that. Because honestly, there wasn't one. He just grunted and started hauling chairs toward the shade. I had a plan, and it was simple. Show up, stay calm, and put Theo first. It was the same strategy I'd used for 3 years of handoffs and awkward school functions. But I had no idea that by the time the sun hit its peak, that plan was going to be tested by fire. The party officially kicked off at noon. For a few minutes, it actually felt like a success. By 12:15, the backyard was a chaotic symphony of screaming 8-year-olds and parents huddling by the cooler. The air was thick with the mouth-watering smell of burgers and hot dogs sizzling on the grill. Theo was a blur of motion, chasing his friends through the sprinkler I'd set up near the back fence. He was laughing that high-pitched, infectious sound that makes you forget about lawyer fees and custody schedules. Every time I looked at him, I felt that familiar ache. A cocktail of pure pride and a crushing sadness that I was only seeing a fraction of this version of him. Then, at exactly 12:30, a black luxury SUV rolled up to the curb. Its tinted windows reflected the suburban street like a dark mirror. I'd seen that car parked in my own old driveway too many times to mistake it for anything else. The engine cut off with a smug, silent finality, and the doors swung open. Jolene stepped out first. She looked like she was headed to a high-end vineyard in Napa rather than a backyard in Dayton. She was wearing a white sundress that probably cost more than my first car and designer sunglasses perched on top of her head. She scanned my house, my chain-link fence, my second-hand patio furniture, and I saw that familiar, thin-lipped disappointment that felt like a slap. Brantley followed, stepping onto the grass like he was afraid he might catch poverty through his Italian leather loafers. He was adjusting his cufflinks, actual cufflinks, at a kid's barbecue in 90-degree heat. He looked less like a guest and more like a guy who was here to foreclose on the property. I grabbed a greasy towel, wiped the charcoal dust off my hands, and walked over to meet them at the gate. I didn't do it out of kindness. I did it because Theo had stopped running and was watching us with an expression that broke my heart. "Donovan," Jolene said. Her voice was devoid of any warmth. It wasn't a greeting, it was a label, a way to acknowledge my presence without actually admitting I belonged there. Jolene, Brantley. I nodded at them both, my voice steady despite the way my pulse was hammering in my ears. "Theo's out back. Food's almost ready." Brantley didn't even look at me. He looked past my shoulder at the house, his lip curling just a fraction. "Cozy place you've got here," he said. His tone was dripping with the kind of condescension you usually reserve for a charity case. I let it slide. I turned back toward the grill before I could say something that would ruin the day. For the next hour, I became a ghost in my own backyard. I focused entirely on the burgers, the smoke from the grill stinging my eyes and masking the fact that I was vibrating with tension. Jolene was working the crowd like a politician, laughing too loudly and complimenting the other moms on their quaint lifestyles. Brantley was even worse. He inserted himself into every conversation and somehow made it about his VP title or the vacation home they were scouting in North Carolina. I watched my mom's knuckles turn white as she gripped her lemonade glass, and Curtis had to retreat to the garage twice just to keep from exploding. The worst part, though? Watching Brantley with my son. Every time Theo ran past, Brantley would reach out and ruffle his hair or pat his shoulder with this practiced, performative affection. It looked like a scene from a pharmaceutical commercial about the perfect family. Every single time he touched him, I saw Theo flinch. It was just a tiny, almost imperceptible pull away, and it made my blood boil in a way I didn't think was possible. When I stepped back into the sunlight, the atmosphere in the backyard, honestly, it had curdled. It was thicker, heavier, like the air right before a tornado touches down. Jolene was already in full director mode. Her voice was a sharp, stage whisper as she barked instructions to everyone for the cake ceremony. She was basically filming a high-budget commercial for her social media followers. And the rest of us? We were just the unpaid extras. She had positioned Theo on the patio, sandwiched tightly between herself and Brantley. Her iPhone was out, angled with surgical precision to catch the perfect family shot. Brantley was leaning in, flashing that practiced, white-toothed VP smile, suggesting they take a formal family portrait before the messy cake cutting began. I saw my mother make a low, guttural sound in her throat. It was a literal growl, while Curtis looked like he was one comment away from throwing a cooler. I ignored the theater of it all. I walked straight to the table, feeling the heat of the wooden boards under that T-Rex cake. I pulled a book of matches from my pocket and started lighting the 8 candles on the dinosaur's back. One for every year I'd watched him grow. One for every year I'd loved him more than my own life. As the small flames flickered to life in the afternoon breeze, I noticed something odd. Theo wasn't looking at the camera. He wasn't listening to his mother's directions about where to put his hands. He kept glancing at me. Then his eyes would dart toward the garage. Then back to my face. There was a frantic energy behind his eyes, like a heavy decision was being made in real time. He looked like a man about to jump off a ledge. "Mom, can I be excused for a minute?" he asked. His voice was small, but urgent. Jolene didn't even look away from her screen. Her thumb was busy adjusting the portrait mode settings. "Make it quick, honey," she said. "We're about to sing, and the lighting is perfect right now." Theo didn't wait for a second answer. He bolted toward the house, his sneakers thudding against the grass. I watched him go, a pit of anxiety opening in my stomach. Honestly, I figured he just had a nervous stomach or needed the bathroom after the stress Jolene had put him through. But 2 minutes later, the screen door slapped shut, and he came back out. He was walking slower now, holding something hidden behind his back. His expression was grim, determined. It was a worn spiral notebook with a faded blue cover. The edges were frayed from being tucked away in a backpack. The notebook itself looked fragile, but the way he held it, it told me it was loaded with high explosives. I didn't recognize it at all. I had no idea what kind of dynamite was tucked between those lined pages. Theo walked slowly back to the cake table, his gait almost regal, and took his place in front of the flickering candles. The heat from the flames licked the air, and the guests gathered around in a semicircle. 20-some phones raised like digital monuments. Everyone was ready to sing the standard birthday anthem. Jolene beamed at the camera lens. Her perfect mom mask was firmly in place. Brantley put on his practiced boardroom smirk. And Theo? He just stood there, clutching that blue notebook against his chest like a shield. He was looking at me with an expression I couldn't quite decipher. It was a mix of heartbreak and absolute terrifying resolve. I could feel the static in the air. Everyone started singing Happy Birthday, their voices carrying in a ragged, off-key tune across my small backyard. Jolene was recording the whole thing, angling the phone to ensure she and Brantley were the primary focus. It was the image of a blended family she wanted to broadcast to the world. But Theo wasn't smiling, and he wasn't making a wish. He was standing perfectly still, his knuckles white as he gripped that blue notebook. It was clearly the most important thing he'd ever held. The song ended, the final note hanging in the humid air, followed by a chorus of claps and cheers. Jolene leaned down, her camera-ready smile inches from his face. "Make a wish, sweetheart. Blow them out." Theo didn't lean forward. He didn't take a breath to blow. Instead, he looked up at the crowd of neighbors and classmates, before finally settling on the adults standing over him. He cleared his throat. His voice was high, but it was impossibly steady. "Can I say something first?" Jolene's smile tightened, her lips pulling thin against her teeth in that way. That meant she was losing her patience, but didn't want the neighbors to see. She was still holding her phone up, the screen probably filled with a high-definition shot of her looking like a saint. "Of course, honey, but let's make it quick so we can have cake," she said. Her tone was a sugary warning that he was deviating from the script she'd written for the day. Theo didn't look at the phone. Honestly, he didn't even look at her. He reached behind his back and pulled out that worn blue spiral notebook. I noticed the pencil smudges on his thumb, and the way the edges of the cover were frayed from being hidden under his mattress for months. His small hands were trembling, the paper rattling just enough for me to hear it from 3 feet away. But when he looked up, his eyes were like flint. "My teacher had us start something called a gratitude journal last year," he began. His voice cut through the thick, humid air of the backyard like a blade. "We're supposed to write down things we're thankful for, and memories we want to keep. I've been writing in it ever since." I saw the confusion ripple through the crowd. Parents started leaning in. The social atmosphere shifted from awkward too electric. Jolene laughed nervously, a sharp, brittle sound that didn't reach her eyes. She tried to reach for the book. That's sweet, baby. But maybe we can share that later, okay? The candles are melting. She was panicked. I could see it in her eyes. A gut instinct was telling her that the narrative was about to slip out of her manicured hands. I want to share it now, Theo said. And for the first time, I heard a man's iron in my son's voice. He stepped back from her reach, his sneakers squeaking on the patio concrete. It's my birthday. I get to decide. The backyard went into a vacuum-sealed silence. So absolute you could hear a distant lawnmower 3 blocks away. Jolene's mouth opened, then closed. Her face was a mask of shocked indignation as she looked at Brantley for backup. Brantley just shrugged. He looked at his expensive watch, catching the sun, looking like he was just checking the time until he could leave this neighborhood. Theo flipped to a page somewhere in the middle of the notebook, his thumb searching for a specific entry. September 14th. Dad taught me how to change a tire today. He said, every man should know how to take care of his car and the people who ride in it. He let me use the wrench by myself. I felt really strong. My throat tightened so hard it felt like I'd swallowed a handful of gravel. I remembered that Sunday afternoon vividly, the smell of rain on the asphalt, and the way he'd grunted as he broke the lug nuts loose. We'd spent 3 hours in the garage that day. Honestly, I hadn't realized he'd gone home and memorialized it like a sacred text. Theo turned another page, the paper whispering in the silence. October 31st. Dad made my Halloween costume by hand because the store was sold out of the one I wanted. I was a velociraptor. It took him 2 whole nights, but he said it was worth it because I was the coolest dinosaur at school. I was. A few people in the crowd smiled. I saw Mom in the back row put her hand over her heart, her eyes softening. Jolene's face, however, was frozen in a terrifying porcelain-white glare. She looked like she was witnessing a murder. Her status as the perfect provider was being dismantled, entry by entry. Theo didn't stop. December 25th, Dad gave me Grandpa's old fishing rod. He said Grandpa would have wanted me to have it. I never met Grandpa, but Dad tells me stories about him. Now I feel like I know him. That's the best present I ever got. I couldn't breathe. The air felt thin, the sunlight too bright, as if the world were being stripped down to its barest truths. My mother was openly weeping now, the tears carving tracks through the flour on her cheeks. Curtis was staring at the ground, his jaw locked tight to keep from losing it. Theo flipped forward a few more pages, his small chest heaving with the effort of what he was about to do. March 8th. Dad came to my school play, even though he had to close his shop early and lose money. He sat in the front row. He was the only parent who stood up and clapped at the end. I saw him. He looked up from the notebook then, his gaze cutting through the crowd until it landed squarely on me. Our eyes met, and in that second, the 3 years of being called a loser and a failure just evaporated into nothing. At 8 years old, my son was looking at me like I was a giant, like I was the only hero he'd ever needed. Brantley's smile vanished instantly, replaced by a look of sheer, panicked discomfort as the neighboring parents started to murmur. Honestly, he looked like he wanted to crawl into his designer loafers and disappear. You bought me a PlayStation last Christmas, Brantley, but you've never played it with me. Not once. Theo's voice didn't waver. It was cold, precise. You said you'd take me fishing, but you always have work stuff. You told Mom you'd come to my baseball game, but you didn't show up. You didn't even call. Jolene surged forward, her hand outstretched like she was going to physically snatch the words out of the air. Theo, honey, that's enough. You're being disrespectful. No, Mom, you said Dad was a loser. You said it in front of everyone. Theo's voice finally cracked, a sob threatening to break through, but he forced himself to stand his ground. But Dad shows up every single time. He never breaks his promises. He built me a go-kart with his own hands. He taught me how to fix things. He makes me chocolate milkshakes every Wednesday and never forgets. Theo slammed the notebook shut. and held it against his chest, like a holy relic. I don't need a new daddy. I already have the best one. Complete, agonizing silence followed. The kind of silence that rings in your ears like a bell. Then, the sound of Jolene's champagne glass slipping from her numb fingers hit the patio. It shattered with a sound like a gunshot, the crystal exploding into 1,000 jagged pieces that caught the light like diamonds in the dirt. Brantley's face was white, not pale, but the color of a sheet of paper. He looked like a man who had just been stripped naked in public, his ego and his lies laid bare by a child who saw right through the cufflinks and the luxury SUV. He muttered something incoherent about needing air and practically jogged toward the street, his leather loafers clicking frantically on the pavement as he fled toward his car without looking back once. Jolene stood there, her mouth opening and closing like a landed fish. Her social standing in the neighborhood was dissolving in real time. The parents who had been listening to her brag for the last hour were now staring at her with expressions that had shifted from polite boredom to a cold, jagged judgment. The audacity of her role model speech was hanging over the yard like a toxic cloud. I didn't care about the gossip or the fallout. I walked around the T-Rex cake, knelt down in the grass, and wrapped my arms around my son. He buried his face in my shoulder, and I felt his small, thin frame shaking with the aftershocks of the courage he'd just displayed. "I'm sorry, Dad," he whispered into my shirt, his voice muffled and thick. "I didn't want her to say those things about you." I held him tighter, my own eyes burning as I felt the weight of his loyalty. "You have nothing to be sorry for, buddy. Nothing in this world." He pulled back after a moment, wiping his nose with the back of a hand that still had a trace of T-Rex frosting on it. He looked at me with those big brown eyes, a small watery smile forming. "Can I see the go-kart now?" I laughed. A ragged, broken sound that felt like the first honest thing I'd done in years. "Yeah, Theo. Let's go see the go-kart." The rest of the afternoon was a blur of vindication. Brantley's black SUV peeled away from the curb with a chirp of tires, and that was the last we saw of him. Jolene tried to linger for 10 minutes, rambling about overtired children and misunderstandings. But the other parents were already turning their backs to her, forming a circle around the grill and the cake. Eventually, she grabbed her designer purse and slunk away to her car, leaving without even saying goodbye to the son she'd just tried to use as a prop. Theo didn't even notice she was gone. He was too busy sitting in the driver's seat of that red go-kart, his hands gripped tight on the steering wheel, grinning wider than I'd seen since the day the divorce papers arrived. We took it for a spin around the backyard, the small engine roaring to life with a puff of blue smoke that smelled like victory. Curtis pushed him for the first few laps, hooting and hollering like a kid himself, while I stood back and watched. My mother was on the patio, her hand pressed to her chest, the tears finally drying as she watched her grandson claim his heritage. One of the dads from Theo's school, a guy who'd barely looked at me earlier, walked up and gave my hand a firm, respectful shake. "That's a fine boy you're raising," he said, his voice low. "You should be proud." I was. More than I could ever put into words. The weeks that followed were a tectonic shift. Jolene called me 3 days later, her voice a screeching siren of fury, accusing me of coaching him and poisoning his mind. I let her rant for 2 minutes, staring out the window at the garage, then calmly told her that the notebook was as much of a surprise to me as it was to her. She didn't believe me, but honestly, it didn't matter. The power dynamic had shifted forever. Slowly, the fighting stopped. She stopped contesting the schedule. She stopped sending me invoices for things she'd decided to buy without asking. Maybe she finally realized that she couldn't buy his heart. Or maybe she was just tired of losing. Either way, the peace was a gift I hadn't expected. 3 months later, the perfect marriage to Brantley imploded. Turns out, his business trips to Miami were actually romantic getaways with a junior analyst from the bank. Jolene found out through a tagged photo on Instagram, and the divorce was as loud and ugly as her entrance to my backyard had been. I didn't gloat, though I wanted to. I just felt a heavy sadness for Theo, who had to watch another adult fail him. 6 months after the party, Jolene called me with a voice that sounded defeated, stripped of its designer polish. She was struggling, buried in legal bills, and working overtime, and she asked if I'd be willing to take primary custody. I said yes before she could even finish the sentence. No conditions. No, I told you so. Just a Friday afternoon pickup that turned into a permanent homecoming. That was a year ago. Today, Theo's room is a disaster zone of dinosaur posters and half-finished model cars. He's in the garage with me every weekend, his hands getting just as stained as mine, learning the trade of his grandfather. We still go to Margie's every Wednesday for those milkshakes, even though he's with me every day now. Some traditions are the glue that holds a life together. Last Tuesday, we were elbow deep in an old motorcycle engine I'd picked up at an estate sale. The air was thick with the scent of degreaser and old metal, and the radio was playing something low and steady. Theo looked up, a streak of grease across his cheek and a wrench in his hand, and just stared at me for a second. "Hey, Dad." "Yeah, buddy? Thanks for always showing up." I had to turn away for a second, pretending to look for a socket, just so he wouldn't see the water in my eyes. When I turned back, I ruffled his hair, leaving a little more grease behind, and smiled. "That's what dads do, Theo. That's what dads do." I spent 3 years believing I was a failure because I didn't have the bank VP title or the luxury SUV. I thought my son would grow up ashamed of the man with the oil-stained fingernails. But kids don't care about the balance in your checking account. They remember who kept their promises. They remember who sat in the front row of the school play when it cost them a day's pay. They remember everything. And one day, they'll tell the world exactly who you are. So, if you're struggling right now, if you feel like you're losing the battle against a louder, richer narrative, just keep showing up. Honestly, love your kids with everything you've got. Because one day, they'll pick up a sword and fight for you. And that moment is worth more than all the money in the world. That's my story. If it hit home for you, or if you know a dad who's grinding through a tough spot, hit that like button and share this. Drop a comment below. I read every single one, and I'd love to hear about your blue notebook moments. Make sure to subscribe and hit the bell so you don't miss the next one. Until next time, take care of your people.